Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Center's Deputy Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk by Jacob Anbinder on the significant ways that land use politics and policies have changed in the latter half of the 20th century. Before I introduce Jacob, I want to let you know about a few other upcoming events. Next Thursday, October 6th at 11 a.m., we and the Hastings Center will be releasing a new report that not only examines the many ways that public, private, and nonprofit entities quickly responded to the challenges that the onset of COVID created for older adults, but also assesses whether and how many of those officially temporary initiatives might be used to improve housing and supports for older adults and address longstanding inequities. At this online event, Jen Malinsky, the project director of the Center's Housing and Aging Society program, will present the report's key findings. Following Jen's remarks, Nancy Berlinger, a research scholar at the Hastings Center, will moderate a panel discussion focused on some of the report's key findings. This will be the first of 4 webinars devoted to various aspects of the report. The next session will be on Thursday, October 20th at 12:30 p.m. And that will focus on the ways that age-friendly and villages initiatives can advance some of these key goals. Next day, on Friday, October 21st at 1:15 p.m., Tommy Hill, who, like today's speaker, is a Meyer Doctoral Fellow here at the Center, will speak about his research into the more than 100-year history of the data infrastructure that forms the backbone of the work done by the Center and most other housing researchers. More details about these and other upcoming events, including 2 exciting book talks in early November, are available on our website, www.jchs.harvard.edu. If you haven't signed up for our mailing list to hear about these and other events, I encourage you to do so. Now on to today's presentation, which features Jacob Anbinder, a PhD in history, who is also one of the Center's Meyer Doctoral Fellows. Jacob will be talking about his dissertation research on the rise of anti-growth politics, particularly in cities, a movement that, as he'll discuss, has both shaped the character of many city neighborhoods and also made it much harder and much more expensive to build new housing, which in turn is helping fuel our current crisis in housing affordability. Jacob will talk for about a half an hour, and afterwards we'll have about 20 to 30 minutes for questions, which you can pose using Zoom's Q&A feature. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your questions. Even if we don't, they're very helpful both for Jacob, who is finishing up his writing, and for the Center because it helps us know what people are interested in. We'll end at about 1:15 p.m. A video of Jacob's talk, the discussion, and his slides will be posted on the Center's website by early next week. Jacob, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. I want to thank the Joint Center and particularly David and James, not just for organizing this event today, but also for supporting my work during my time writing this dissertation, most recently in the form of the Meyer Fellowship, but also prior to that in the form of a student research support grant. And even more so because I think it's somewhat uncommon for the Joint Center to sponsor a historian's work. So I'm especially grateful for this opportunity to lend a perspective on urban policy from my field today, even if the style and content of this talk may be a little different from what some of the regulars here are used to. So as David said, my name is Jake Anbinder. I'm currently a PhD candidate in the history department here at Harvard. This talk today, which I'm going to share my screen on now, can everyone see? Excellent. It's derived from my dissertation, which is called Cities of Amber, Anti-Growth Politics and the Making of Modern Liberalism. What I want to do in the next half hour is to kind of go gradually from the 10,000-foot view of this project down to street level, or at least as gradually as this brief time will allow. And I'll do this in roughly 3 stages. The first will be to start out with an overview of the project, why I decided to write this dissertation, what I mean when I say the neighborhood growth revolt and the new urban liberalism. Then I'll talk a little bit about this idea of community control on the political left, broadly construed. Where did it come from? How did it evolve? Who were some of the key actors in this broader story of what I call anti-growth politics? And then finally, we'll spend some time looking at what I call, or rather what became of this idea of community control in one place, New York City, which I think serves as a particularly good case study as the idea relates to the politics of urban growth. How did this moment of possibility in the 60s, when left of center people began to agree that community control was a good and desirable thing, resolve itself in the 70s and 80s? And what implications does that resolution have for how we should view this history as a whole? So there's an aphorism among historians that it's impossible to write about the past in such a way where you're not also trying to make sense of the time in which you're writing. And that is very true for me and this project. The idea for Cities of Amber really began, I always tell people, with my experience of apartment hunting as a 20-something. And as I'm sure many of you know, it's a pretty miserable experience, especially in places like New York, Boston, and San Francisco. The housing is in such bad condition and so expensive and so scarce. And this slide really, I think, demonstrates that last point, the scarcity. It's simply a graph of new privately owned homes in the US as a per capita rather. So you can see we really bottomed out at the last recession, and even now with the post Great Recession recovery are only really beginning to reach some of the troughs of previous recessions. And here's a similar chart just focused on New York City. And this one is not per capita, but you see a similar lack of new housing supply in New York City. And not only that I started to notice, but the more ostensibly progressive the place where I was looking for housing, the more expensive, scarce, and lousy it seemed to be. And when I first started talking about this idea for this project with people, a common reaction I got was, well, these places have always been expensive. And I quickly found out that that just wasn't true, or at least it wasn't true to the extent that it is today. And nor was the dynamic, which is also true today, which is that these places are in our current party system, by pretty much anyone's definition, the base of the modern Democratic Party, which I feel like this image, which has made the rounds on the internet, particularly illustrates. So in other words, it started to become clear to me that there was a sort of twin dynamic at work here, of there being an acute across-the-board housing shortage in these prosperous coastal cities, and the crisis being somehow linked to these places' emergent identities as liberal enclaves in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And that's really the question at the heart of Cities of Amber. How did we get here? How did America's most ostensibly progressive places become unaffordable for most Americans? As these headlines show, this is a question that has attracted some interest of late from some pretty big names. But I think this story goes beyond how we typically talk about this issue, which is one of NIMBYism. To me, NIMBYism implies a kind of superficial story of economically rational people wanting to keep their block, their neighborhood, looking a certain way to preserve the value of their property, or simply because they are racist or otherwise prejudiced. And to be clear, I think that certainly explains some of what is going on here, perhaps even a lot of what is going on here. But the more I started to look into this, the more I became convinced that for at least a lot of the people in this history, this did not really explain the full story. The tight restrictions on the growth of these blue cities and suburbs were not always the result of economic self-interest or conspiracies of secret conservatives posing as liberals. Rather, I came to conclude that there was an ideological basis for their beliefs. You go back to the years immediately after World War II, Democrats in cities across the country were emphatically supportive of what the sociologist Harvey Mollich famously called the growth machine. But you get to the end of the 20th century, Democrats in cities and suburbs are much more skeptical of, and in many cases, downright hostile toward, not only urban growth itself, but also the idea that such growth was in any way compatible with liberalism, as these liberals had come to define it. And so it's out of this premise that I began to develop this idea of what I call anti-growth liberalism. And here you see just two particularly illustrative artworks. These are both about the Bay Area, and I love to show them in every talk that I give on this topic. So there was this moment in time when the question of urban growth itself became extremely contested. And this question was inextricable from the changes that were also taking place nationwide in the composition and priorities of the Democratic Party. In particular, there was this idea that post-war society, in its relentless quest for economic prosperity, had lost sight of the things that made life worth living. Another was that New Deal liberalism was deeply implicated in the emergence of this problem. And a third idea was that the continued growth of cities was not merely a symptom of this disease, but a major cause of it. And so with that capsule summary of the project, I want to move now to talking about community control specifically. And I want to be clear from the outset that this thing I'm rather loosely calling community control in this talk today, this pivot in left-wing politics in favor of devolution of political decision-making, is not the same thing as anti-growth politics. You could write an entire dissertation on community control, and in fact, many people have, and really not mention the question of urban growth very much at all. But I think, for my purposes, if you're asking where did anti-growth liberalism come from, who subscribed to it, how did its constituent elements work together, what did it achieve, where did it fail, and how did it evolve over time, this emergent orientation within democratic politics toward the neighborhood, toward the community, that you might even say toward smallness in general, is the specter that looms over a large part of this story. In cities across the country, the interventionist redevelopment schemes of the 30s, 40s, and 50s reflected a core conviction that efficiency, technocratic expertise, and centralized decision-making were critical to achieving liberalism's full potential. But by the time you get to the 60s and 70s and beyond, the excesses and injustices of this mode of thinking had cultivated a pervasive sense that the crises cities faced by that point were the result of these very same political structures, which had put distant bureaucrats beholden to regressive and illiberal interests in charge of addressing what people now saw as fundamentally local issues. So this new generation of liberals, decision-making at the lowest levels of government seemed to be the solution, the way that the influence of these distant malefactors might be countered and eventually exterminated. So in the wake of the turbulent urban transformations of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I want to make the case that we should think of community control as the conceptual foundation on which liberals rebuilt their urban policy for the 70s and beyond. And as part of this process, the community control movement ultimately changed liberals' ideas of the way that government should relate to its citizens, the institutions that ought to be empowered to mediate that relationship, and the social formations around which public policy should be designed. It also changed the basic goals that liberals sought to achieve through their urban policy. In an age of depersonalization and anonymity, liberalism would promote solidarity at the smallest scales of the city, the family, the home, block, and the neighborhood. In an age when interpersonal relationships seem smothered by government, corporate, and cultural bigness, liberalism would champion that which was grassroots, artisanal, local, and natural. In an age of instability, liberalism would explore whether nostalgia and stability might guide cities toward more progressive ends, whether in fact nostalgia and stability might be liberal values in and of themselves. Ultimately, and I think you probably see where I'm going with this at this point, this new iteration of liberalism also prescribed a particular spatial logic for the city as well. These decentralists, these supporters of community control, were not only skeptical about the benefits of cities' physical renewal, they also believed that the insatiable quest for urban growth was the reason that the previous iteration of liberalism had come to face an identity crisis. As one New York journalist and Democratic political advisor wrote in 1975, quote, "I no longer look back on the New Deal with nostalgia, and now see that it was the beginning of the imperial presidency. The best bulwark we have against fascism in this country is in small, difficult to penetrate units, small businesses and low-rise neighborhoods, where people know each other, where they experience family and close friends." So now, having laid this out for you, I want to talk about where this decentralist impulse in urban liberalism came from. Was the desire for community control something that urban liberalism generated inside itself, Or was it forced upon it by external powers? Well, the answer, of course, is both. In particular, I want to focus on three key movements that I see as being particularly influential in the development of this idea of community control on the left. So a helpful place to start, I think, is Berkeley, California, which you see here in 1964 and 1965. The student demonstrations there, in which thousands of students occupied administrative buildings demanding reforms to the university, were the most visible eruption yet of the dissatisfaction with post-war society that was at the heart of what became known as the New Left. The organization at the center of this movement in the US was a group known as Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. At Berkeley and in similar spaces across the country, the prevailing attitude among new leftists was that liberalism had failed not just on a programmatic level, but on a spiritual one, by inhibiting the creative and humanistic capacities of society. But they also believed that previous iterations of the left were outdated in their focus on the workplace as the main site of political action. Instead, advanced capitalism had, in their view, created a class of permanently unemployed Americans who could be found on a given weekday, not on a shop floor, but in the ever-growing slums in cities across America. In an effort to reach this urban lumpen proletariat, SDS launched the Economic Research and Action Program, or ERAP, in late 1963, working mainly in deindustrializing cities like Newark, Chicago, and Cleveland. The project would attempt to help residents of target areas establish community unions. This was a kind of term of art. Initial efforts were basic and focused on things like rent strikes, making sure garbage got picked up on time. But these were kind of secondary importance to what workers saw as their main goal, introducing a new process of democratic engagement that emphasized decentralization and grassroots participation. As one SDS organizer explained, an ERAP community union is one of those rare organizations where the founders define their task largely in terms of how successfully they give away their own power. Another SDS member proudly noted that an ERAP meeting was, quote, probably the only institution in the world where a destitute alcoholic can stand up and give a lecture, occasionally brilliant, but usually incoherent, on political strategy and be listened to with complete respect. The ERAP projects were very much of their time and place, however, in the way that they set their sights squarely on the pro-growth initiatives of post-war urban liberalism. There was no better domestic example of this industry-government symbiosis, wrote one SDS leader, than a program like urban renewal. As another member explained, herein lies the value of a community union. Nowhere else are the arrogant, totalitarian, and inflexible assumptions of liberal politics confronted as they are here. President Johnson may think that he is the policeman of the world, but his mayors think that they are the policemen of the cities, and the organized poor are able to stand up to them in a way that the Vietnamese are not yet in a position to stand up to Johnson. So here you have the kind of invocation of the Vietnam War almost as an analogous fight, an analogous problem in American society to this organizing effort going on among the urban poor. So the idea of the small community held special value for the New Left in two ways. First, it was the structural counterweight to this liberal corporatism's domination of City Hall. And second, it was supposed to be the spiritual antidote to the alienating tendencies of post-war life. But organizers noted issues with the premise behind ERAP almost immediately. How would organizers know what constituted a community? What happened if community consensus was impossible to reach? What if the people they found in neighborhoods actually preferred old-fashioned liberalism to the alternative they were offering? What if, God forbid, SDS was actually engaging in its own form of manipulation, ethically no better than what it was fighting against? As you might imagine, these would become recurring questions as ideas about decentralization and community control grew in popularity. Due to funding issues and other problems, ERAP ultimately lasted just 3 years. SDS itself had dissolved by the early 70s, but the ideas elaborated by the New Left survived the demise of the movement itself. In fact, despite New Leftists' scathing critiques of LBJ and mainstream liberalism, many similar ideas were already being expressed by mainstream liberals themselves, including those close to Johnson. Under the leadership of Robert C. Weaver, who you see here, Johnson's Department of Housing and Urban Development had already begun to require that cities' urban renewal agencies establish project area committees. These groups did not have very much formal power, but their existence showed a recognition from the federal government that a lack of local input had been one of urban renewal's most egregious sins, as it had been practiced by previous administrations. Some parts of Johnson's war on poverty went even further in the direction of community control. The Community Action Program, or CAP, was a particularly notable example. CAP was premised on the theory that one of the most direct ways to fight poverty was to put federal funds straight into the hands of local nonprofit organizations, known as community action agencies. CAP's decentralized structure represented uncharted territory for many liberals, and some of the language used by federal officials to describe the program would not have been out of place in an SDS manifesto. The philosophy behind the program, explained one pamphlet, was that, quote, the individual community decides how best to attack poverty in its midst. Initiative and direction must come from the community itself. The letter of the law, too, required CAP to be developed, conducted, and administered with the maximum feasible participation of residents of the areas and members of the groups served. While there's little evidence that lawmakers gave much thought to this term, maximum feasible participation became a phrase indelibly associated with the radical potential of CAP's grassroots philosophy. Like SDS's own program, however, CAP was racked by internal tensions. Mayors who had become accustomed to controlling the flow of federal urban renewal funds were outraged at what they saw as an end around from Washington. Critics pounced on examples of CAP funding that seemed like left-wing radicalism run amok. In response, federal officials insisted that maximum feasible participation had never been a goal to be taken literally. As OEO Director Sergeant Shriver clarified in 1966, we have no intention, of course, of letting any one group, even the poor themselves, run the jobs or run the programs. Despite these problems, though, CAP did represent a tacit admission from the Johnson administration that there was merit to the New Left's critique. And it seemed like proof to many that the innermost sancta of establishment liberalism had been infiltrated by what one observer called the mystique of participation. Old-fashioned parochialism suddenly no longer seemed so parochial, but rather a legitimate, democratic, and progressive means of ascertaining, organizing, and addressing the demands of different urban communities. But there was also a third key group that was instrumental in facilitating the transition toward a more decentralized version of liberalism, one that we can't not talk about in the context of debates over the desirability of urban growth, and that's urban planners themselves. Dating back to the City Beautiful movement of the late 19th century, the idea of urban planning as the technocratic profession par excellence, improving cities through dispassionate application of social scientific principles, had been endorsed at the topmost levels of progressive thinking. By the late 60s, however, planners too were starting to question this received wisdom that had permeated the profession for decades. Not only had the traditional approach to planning proven incapable of addressing cities' intractable mid-century problems, the discipline was now being accused, quite credibly in some cases, of having actually exacerbated these problems. What planners had believed was a rationalist, publicly minded approach to their work seemed to have made cities more hospitable for commerce, but less hospitable for the people who lived in them. Someone who epitomized this shift is the person whose book you see at the bottom left, the planner Robert Goodman. In 1966, Goodman withdrew from his graduate program at Harvard with a half-finished dissertation, something that scared me a little bit when I read it, since I feel like that's something grad students are always thinking about. But it turns out Goodman wasn't alone. One planner confessed to his colleagues in a speech at the 1968 meeting of the American Institute of Planners. The truth is that for half a century, our profession has specialized predominantly in advocacy planning for the business community. Another declared that planners were facing nothing less than, quote, a crisis of identity as a result of their apparent impotence in the face of cities' many problems. For many planners, though I should say not all, the answer lay in community control. As the profession entered the 70s, planners began to speak of their work as a process of ascertaining and interpreting local needs rather than a practice of applying their knowledge and expertise. And they founded a constellation of new groups, like Boston's Urban Planning Aid, San Francisco's Community Design Center, MIT's Urban Fellows Program, and Harvard's own Urban Field Service. These were intended to serve as new models for how planners might interact with and work on behalf of the most vulnerable urban residents. The approach they pioneered went by different terms, including advocacy planning, plural planning, equity planning, and community planning, many of which I'm sure, especially the people here who have done city planning programs, have heard recently as well. But all of these, regardless of what you called them, shared a sense that the technocratic, centralized style of policymaking had done the urban poor more harm than good. Nevertheless, and this, as you can see, is a repeating tendency, advocacy planners faced many of the same questions that SDS's program had encountered just a few years earlier. How were planners sure that they themselves were not exerting undue influence on the same people they were trying to help? In one analysis of the state of the planning professions published in the early 70s, 6 of the 9 cities studied had already implemented some form of community planning. But the city planners in these places were not satisfied with the new direction of their work. Even those who liked the idea in theory told the researchers that in practice, it was the neighborhoods that complained the most that tended to earn their attention. Others found it difficult to identify community leaders or organizations in a given neighborhood. And when such groups did exist, they often seemed anti-democratic, desiring a direct voice in city affairs for their own members, rather than claiming to represent the interests of all community residents, or perhaps falsely claiming to represent the interests of all community residents. It's easy to overstate planners' influence on the trajectory of this history. But I think in this milieu of uncertainty over what it meant to be a liberal, planners' embrace of community control, even if the meaning of that phrase was something to be worked out later, not only gave such ideas an imprimatur of legitimacy, they also constituted an endorsement of the idea that community control was consistent with liberalism writ large. In doing so, planners ultimately helped craft the vocabulary that community control needed to claim a place of privilege within post-60s urban policy, even if the outcomes of this work were not always the ones that planners anticipated or desired. So it's on this note that we move to the final section of this talk, which is about New York City. And as I hope is already clear, the push for community control was not something exclusive to New York. In fact, between 1970 and 1977, more than 40 cities across the country devolved some form of formal governance role to neighborhood organizations. But I find New York to be a particularly good case study for a couple of reasons. First, focusing on it highlights how the issue of community control reconfigured Democrats' urban voter base. In areas like Brooklyn Heights and Greenwich Village that were transforming into hubs of the city's professional classes, neighborhood activists fought high-rises, hot dog stands, and any other project that threatened their Jane Jacobs-inflected ideal of city living. Meanwhile, in more modest neighborhoods whose residents once formed the middle-class rank and file of the New Deal coalition, community control became a cudgel for self-identified liberals to resist racial integration and affordable housing. But the second reason is the New York case study demonstrates with particular clarity how, in wealthy and middle-class neighborhoods alike, community control intersected with opposition to urban growth. New York's community control liberals of the 70s and 80s grounded their demands for quality of life improvements in a broader spatial argument about the undesirability of growth and its effect on the urban environment. To them, City Hall's aloof attitude and undesirable changes in the city's low-rise neighborhoods were interrelated products of the same pro-growth tendencies of centralized urban governance. By contrast, they argued, local decision-making would guarantee the community stability and absence of physical change that they believed was essential to the achievement of other liberal goals. In the 70s and beyond, New Yorkers enacted laws and implemented processes that slowed the pace of development by requiring community input. In the parts of the city where this anti-growth vision was most appealing, these reforms became the community control advocates' most pressing goal. And today, I would argue, and I think many on this talk would agree, it remains their most enduring legacy. So what were these laws and processes? Overwhelmingly, they involved a single institution, the New York City Community Boards. The community boards were not the only form of decentralized government implemented in New York in the 70s. Mayor John Lindsay, for example, started an Office of Neighborhood Government and tried to implement a system of little city halls, similar to the ones that Mayor White implemented in Boston, to offer constituent services. And these proved popular among some residents, particularly poor residents and people of color, but they fell by the wayside soon after Lindsay left office. But the community boards, by contrast, were and are today overwhelmingly the biggest legacy of the decentralist impulse in New York City politics. All this despite the fact that the boards were at the time, and by some measures remain today, a pretty obscure government institution. Their modern history began in 1951, when Robert Wagner established 12 community planning councils across Manhattan. They were expanded in 1963 to cover the whole city and renamed community planning boards, with volunteers appointed by the borough presidents. But their role to that point in time, to the extent that they had any at all, was vague and strictly advisory. And you go back into the archives and you find constant complaints that the boards don't do anything, that they're really just places for the borough presidents to appoint their friends to do them favors. And they might have remained this way, but for a few incidents that stoked New Yorkers' demands for greater neighborhood input in planning decisions. And these were not always positive. One demonstrated the direction that things were going in with particular clarity, I think. In 1966, the Lindsay administration announced its intention to build about 800 units of low-income housing across 7 new buildings in Forest Hills, a middle-class, suburban, and largely Jewish neighborhood in eastern Queens. By the early 70s, grassroots opposition had begun to coalesce. While several community groups supported the new housing, others suspected, not entirely unreasonably, that Forest Hills had been chosen on the assumption that a neighborhood of reliably liberal Jewish voters would be less likely to fight the project than the borough's other ethnic enclaves. Things reached a boiling point on November 18th, 1971, which you see 2 photos from here. That night, a mob of locals gathered at the intended site of the housing project and threw flaming torches and rocks at the construction trailers parked there. You see that in the photo on the right, and this photo ran on the front page of the New York Times the following morning. Meanwhile, 2 blocks away, an overflow crowd of protesters filled the meeting room of a local civic association. One person held a sign, which you can see in the back there: Forest Hills demands community control. The protesters were not successful in stopping the construction of the housing project, but they did extract significant concessions. The city agreed to cut the amount of new housing in half, and the apartments would be cooperatively owned and managed, which meant that potential tenants had to show they had enough savings to maintain their units. Finally, 65% of the homes would be reserved for the elderly and 35% for veterans. So when the apartments finally opened a few years later, it did not really surprise anyone that 70% of the tenants, as a result of these new rules, were white. Many who have watched these events in Forest Hills believe that it represented a sea change in community control politics. The New Yorkers who attended the hearings and picketed the construction site were not hardcore conservatives, but rather were Lindsay's own base of liberals. As the leader of the housing opponents argued, do they mean that community participation is only applicable in East New York, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Harlem, and Brownsville, and not for the middle-income people of Forest Hills? I think the racial implications of that grouping of neighborhoods should be obvious to everyone here. And these events did trouble some of the city's most prominent Democrats at the time. Mario Cuomo wrote in his diary, "The idea of absolute community control, while superficially appealing, cannot work in this city. Obviously, were each community like Forest Hills to have the last word on public projects within its boundaries, public projects and therefore city life would be almost totally stultified." With each passing day, however, Cuomo's opinion was held by fewer and fewer of his fellow liberals. In December 1971, the Manhattan Borough President remarked on the deluge of applications that his office had received to serve on community boards, which he directly attributed to the events in Forest Hills. At a meeting of a Bronx community board that same month, a journalist observed an opponent of a project for wayward youths in the neighborhood who stomped up to the microphone and asked a simple question: "How do I get on this board?" The scene, reported the New York Times, is being repeated in many of the city's 62 community board districts these days. When in 1972, Governor Nelson Rockefeller convened a bipartisan commission to reform the city's charter, he cited the widespread dissatisfaction with the structure of city government as the reason. Over the next few years, this charter revision commission held over 1,000 hours of meetings and called more than 700 witnesses to determine how best to decentralize New York City. And much of their work ended up focusing on the community boards. In their research, 71% of community board members had said that the board should have greater authority on zoning matters, more than any other issue. Another study had found that 62% of board members believe the boards and the city government should have equal say over land use decisions, which would be still a significant concession to the community boards. An additional 21%, so 1 in 5, believed neighborhoods should have complete control over land use. And the commission's proposals, which were made public in 1975, sought to fulfill these desires by and large. In the election that November, only about 1 in 4 voters turned out, which makes sense because it was an off year. But those who did decisively broke in favor of the reforms, with the strongest support coming from upper middle class liberal parts of Manhattan. On the matter of reviewing and approving new developments, the changes took the form of a new Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, known as ULURP. Any project that required changes to the zoning code or the city map was now subject to the approval of the relevant board, as was any proposal that involved new publicly supported housing. The New York Times editorial board wrote that, quote, "A quiet revolution has taken place in planning in New York, as deep-rooted local understanding of the area's character and needs was now replacing the old tendency to virtually bulldoze all neighborhood character for a homogenized uniformity of disastrous, high-rise, open space formulas." So, by the end of the 70s, the community boards had firmly established a reputation as a force to be taken seriously in the city's growth politics. Moreover, they helped legitimize the broader idea that community consultation was a natural component of the development process. Developers who were serious about seeing projects to completion started to seek out the advice of community boards long before any project was announced, as to the sorts of buildings that members would find acceptable. Board members and their allies made clear that they considered their role in land use policy to be their paramount purpose. As the chair of Queens Community Board 7 explained, community boards oppose development when it has a negative impact on the community. That's what they are for. As urban policy scholars conducted the first wave of research into the post-reform boards, however, their findings highlighted the many ways in which they fell short of their promise. Only 36% of New Yorkers had even heard of them. Just 6% could name the community district in which they lived, and 3% could describe with any accuracy what it was that the boards did. Turnout, too, varied wildly by community district. While nearly a quarter of residents on the Upper West Side had attended a board meeting, which I find really extraordinary, the same was true for only 2% of people in the South Bronx. Stories also began to emerge of extraordinary examples of community board intransigence. A restaurant owner who was advised to visit the homes of members of Community Board 2 before requesting approval to renovate the facade of his business in Greenwich Village was shocked, he later wrote, by his experience dealing, quote, not with the community, but rather with individuals who are seeking to impose their own personal opinions and demonstrate their accumulations of personal power. While he was eventually able to open his restaurant, he did so without the renovations. The food and service will be remarkable, he assured, but one cannot help but see the community as the final and still helpless loser. So with that whirlwind tour through this history, I'll now finish up with some brief concluding thoughts. And I think in other Joint Center talks, this is where I would give some policy recommendations, or at least point in that direction. And I could definitely do that. I think it's very easy, in fact, to see a through line from this era of community control to the urban housing crisis of today, one in which supply has failed to keep up with demand, in which real estate prices have far outpaced wage growth in many cities, in which tenants not only face exorbitant rents and historically low vacancy rates, but through their inability to buy real estate are increasingly excluded from the dominant American mode of wealth building altogether. And all this to say nothing of what you see on this slide, the unsustainable sprawl, as well as the intensified racial segregation and other problems that plague our present day patterns of metropolitan development. And so it's very tempting to say, well, these people did this thing in the past and it worked out this way, and now we need to do the opposite. And it's true that if you tried to pin me down on some sort of policy proposal for how to fix our present housing crisis, I will admit it would look something like that. But part of the reason I wanted to sketch this big narrative arc of community-controlled politics for you is precisely to show how things that look very certain from the perspective of the present can look very uncertain through the lens of history. In an era when people have begun to yearn once again for master builders it is very easy, I think, to dismiss the community control movements of the past as simply wrong-headed or conspiratorial. And in some cases, I think that is certainly an accurate judgment. But really what I hope you come away with this talk with is the opposite idea, that this is a more complex, ambiguous, and even tragic story of an unlikely process by which urban liberals, searching for liberalism's meaning and purpose beyond the 60s, tried to refashion for their own ends a governing philosophy with strong conservative undertones, and some would argue strong conservative results, in order to right the very real wrongs of their own post-war urban politics. Undoubtedly, the community control movement often struggled and continues to struggle to the extent that it exists today to live up to the communitarian ideals of many of its initial proponents. And many of these issues stem from the same unresolved and perhaps unresolvable questions that were identified 60 years ago. Who ought to participate in community politics? How and whether participation should be encouraged, and how to resolve disagreements among participants. And I certainly think it is valid to say that this was a gaping hole in the logic of community control, one whose effects continue to influence us today in negative ways. But I also think, to return to this slide and my dissertation as a whole, that when we talk about anti-growth politics, this also ought to complicate our idea of what it is that we are grappling with. I showed this slide earlier in the talk, and like I said, if you spent time on social media related to housing, you've seen something like this, or maybe this exact picture. I think it's very easy to simply see this as the millionth example of liberal hypocrisy, particularly with the increasingly upper middle class suburban Democratic Party we have today. But what I want to leave you with today is the idea that it's not hypocrisy at all. Rather, it's a much deeper unresolved tension within this thing we call liberalism over how to achieve redistributive ends in equitable ways. And it's one that liberals today, particularly of those of the next generation, so here you have examples of AOC, grapple with every day as it comes to urban policy, often without really realizing it. As one member of Manhattan's Community Board 6 wrote in 1974, it's as though we all thought participatory democracy was a grand idea until we tried it. Thank you very much.
Wow. There's so much here. And thank you. I think really fascinating. I can't wait to read it. And I'm sure there's going to be a terrific book in here at some point. Let me start out. I was struck by race not playing as big a role in your story as I would have expected, both in terms of the forces behind this. So, we're talking the 60s. At the beginning of this time is sort of the heyday of the civil rights movement, and it's also an era of urban riots. And so I'm just wondering, I mean, you're telling very much a story about the rise of a professional middle class, primarily white. And so, one question is sort of, to what extent is racial tension part of the formation story? And then there's a sort of second question, which I can come back to if you want, which is your observations about the operations of the community boards, both in sort of the historically Black neighborhoods, so someplace like Bedford-Stuyvesant, but also one of the striking things in New York and many other cities in this period is the huge rise of with the 1965 Immigration Act, completely new communities emerging. And I don't know if your research is taking you to look at the operations of community boards in neighborhoods that became sort of gateway areas. But let's just start with the origin story and to what extent did both the civil rights movement and racial tensions play, not the racial tensions in Forest Hills, but in other parts of New York City or other cities.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent question. And the short answer is race looms over this entire story. And you say not just Forest Hills, but I think the Forest Hills example shows race intersects with the story in a few ways. One is, I think examples like Forest Hills reveal that many of the white ethnic so-called communities' participation in and agreement to, implicit agreement to the kind of New Deal style redistribution of wealth, which often implicated the physical renewal of cities, was quite temporary and very contingent, and I think one thing when we talk about how the rhetoric and the structure of community control brought about the dissolution of that New Deal coalition, one thing we absolutely have to talk about is how that idea that decision-making in cities on smaller scales would bring about a truer progressivism, absolutely gave places like Forest Hills an out of, in their case, of a public housing project, and in many other cases, similar projects, or really anything that implicated, redistribution of wealth to communities of color or neighborhood integration. And so, yeah, that is certainly a key part of this story. And it's a difficult part to analyze in that, I think a very common narrative among historians, and a correct narrative about cities in this era, concerns the way that these so-called white ethnic communities left the Democratic Party entirely. And so here I think of Tom Segru's work, Arnold Hirsch's book on Chicago, to a certain extent, other books that really talk about, the rise of the modern Republican Party as, intersecting with this disillusionment among white former Democrats in cities with the Democratic Party, which was, extremely, which was part and parcel with their racism, frankly. So in some ways, this is a more complicated story I'm telling, in that these people still consider themselves liberal on some level, and to this day, form the basis of the modern Democratic Party, a party that, I think it's fair to say, some people on the call may disagree with me, at least purports to care about racial equality and redistribution of wealth. I mean, certainly more than, than the party that they tend to go up against in elections. And so this is a complicated story in that it's easy to simply dismiss the community, the kind of white upper middle class community control neighborhoods as racist. And I think in many cases they were and are. But we also have to consider the more complicated way in which they somehow believed what they were doing on some level to not be racist, which distinguishes them, I think, from the kind of more out and out racial hatred that you see in the white ethnic communities that were leaving for the Republican Party. So that's something that I'm still trying to figuring out how to analyze and interpret in the context of the dissertation. But yes, absolutely. And then the second way I would say that race intersects with this story is, and this kind of largely got cut from this particular talk, but is there in the dissertation, is, there was a vibrant community control movement in African-American neighborhoods, in particular in New York City and other places. And I would chronologically, it's interesting that this emerges kind of along with the New Left, which was in its time and is still criticized as being a predominantly white movement. And people note the way that this emerges, ironically, alongside the white neighborhoods' quest for the same goal. And I have a line that wasn't in the talk, but is in the chapter the talk is based on people observing the operations of the community boards in New York City in the 70s and 80s. And two things pop out. One is that many of the most prominent community control activists were Black, and yet the movement now seemed to have been kind of co-opted by white people, often for explicitly, anti-Black goals. But also that the demands, without getting into too much detail, the demands of Black community control activists often did not have very much to do with stopping urban growth. They had to do, in many ways, with investment in their neighborhoods, the exact opposite thing. And in some ways, the story of the community boards in New York City purportedly being about a bunch of different kinds of community control, but really in practice being about stopping urban growth. What happens is, I think the nature of the game, so to speak, that these poorer neighborhoods of color are playing is revealed to them. And people notice this at the time. They say, that these sparsely attended community board meetings in the Bronx and in Black parts of Brooklyn, what they want is, better access to the city services that the city is kind of rolling back, rather than, attempting to stop a particular building from going up. And so, absolutely, there's a broader story here in which race plays a much more complicated role than I gave it credit for in this brief talk. But yeah, thank you for that question.
I mean, you already covered a huge amount of ground. Several fabulous questions, and we won't have time to get to them. So I'm gonna pick and choose here. Somebody raised the question about, where do you see community development corporations, CDCs, fitting into this story? This is the same era that they emerge in places like New York and Boston as really seemingly quite important players. And I'm just trying to build how, we can sort of, so I'm just wondering, I don't know if they're part of your actual research, or that you can describe, or at least just sort of think about that as an area.
Yeah, well, they are and they aren't, I would say. So some excellent research has been done on the history of community development corporations. I think of Brian Goldstein's book on Harlem. And in part, that book is so good that I hesitate to delve too deeply into that, because, not only did I have to cut so much for this talk, but, the dissertation itself, so I could go in so many directions that I will never have time to go in. But certainly they emerged as a different variety, I think, of community control politics beyond the ones that I discussed in this talk. And one that, connects to what I mentioned earlier about, in a couple of ways. One, the perceived needs of communities of color in the city, that the disinvestment was the problem. And so the purpose of the community development corporations was to attract investment, in some ways, a goal that ran against those of the kind of anti-growth community boards. But, this was taking place in other parts of the city. So I don't think their goals were usually explicitly against each other. And then, as I think has been documented, the development of that kind of structure of community investment both runs into questions about the extent to which those boards are representative, or those corporations are representative of the community's interests. So many of the same questions that the people I just discussed ran into. And then also, in the context of what happens later in the 20th century, kind of set the stage for what we now call gentrification. And so they're absolutely a part of this history. For the purposes of the dissertation being about kind of expressly, movements against urban growth, I don't see them playing as big a role, but they are certainly, when we talk about community control, another expression of that impulse that I didn't have time to mention here. Absolutely.
A question on community control. I think you and I talked about this when one of our conversations before the talk. It's both a de jure and a de facto. So de jure, New York has always struck me as somewhat unique in that it actually gave real power to these community boards. And I'm wondering if you have a sense. I'm not asking for the specific number, but how common in law have you found some equivalent of the New York community control boards? And having said that, is it your sense that a lot of the places that didn't codify it in practice, so Boston has never given the community boards that level of control, but one might argue community groups at some level pretty much play an almost similar role. So how much you see it, in law, and then how seriously should we take that distinction as opposed to what happens in practice?
Absolutely, yeah. And I would not take it so I don't think the distinction is that important because, you can look at other cities and their rates of housing construction and also the kind of political structures of urban development in this era. And different cities find different ways to get to know, so to speak. New York is a particularly good case study, I think, because as you say, the process by which the community boards came to play this very literal role in approving or rejecting development was so blatant. I think the closest analog is probably Washington, D.C. with its advisory neighborhood councils, with they don't have something that's exactly like ULURP, but I think the ANCs do have certain powers to shape certain formal powers to shape development. But you look at a place like San Francisco, where the form that kind of the community control movement took was not something like ULURP. It was the creation of supervisor districts. So they used to have at-large elections for supervisors, and then they moved toward districts, and then I think they moved back and then back again. It's a long, complicated, but it was the same kind of expression of this desire for greater self-determination among the neighborhoods over the future of development around them. And so that's where you see politicians like Harvey Milk come to power, kind of on that platform of railing against downtown interests and in favor of neighborhood preservation. So really, I don't think the structure is particularly important. I think for my purposes as a writer and researcher, New York just kind of stands out as a great case study.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, when you write about New York, you always have to also deal with the fact that it's just, the magnitude of scale compared to almost all other cities. It is so great. There were a couple of interesting questions about how you might think about this framework as it relates to suburbanites. If we think, there are places that are kind of bastions of suburban liberalism, which may, the sign that you put up, I don't know whether it came from a city or a suburban locale. And I'm just, can one tell the same broad ideological story about suburbs, but a different kind of implementing mechanism? Is that essentially what local zoning does? Just wondering how you think about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. I mean, part of the premise of my dissertation, and I didn't really have time to go over it here, but that this is a metropolitan story. It's a story of both urban communities and suburban communities for different reasons, joining together in this inadvertent and complex alliance against growth and change in their backyards. And the structures were different, which is in part why suburbs don't show up much in this talk. But it's as you note, in some ways, what the community control movement in cities, at least insofar as it relates to growth politics, was trying to do was to give city dwellers the same powers over local growth and change that suburbs also already had by virtue of their kind of municipal structure. That's not to say that there weren't similar movements in suburbs. People perceived suburbs as also becoming overdeveloped and too crowded, and suburbanites often had the same fears of racial integration or what have you. And those found expression in different sets of laws and policies. So I have an entire chapter on kind of the environmental movement as it relates to suburbs. And I think often it took it assumed the guise of environmental politics, and people noticed this at the time. You have a great book that I recommend to everyone here called The Environmental Protection Hustle, where people note that, similar to the way that you might say the Forest Hills residents co-opted the language of community control that had been first articulated by people on the New Left or people working within CAP. You have people who co-opt the language of environmentalism to reach kind of the same goals in suburban environments. So this is absolutely an urban and suburban story, and I think I'll just add that that's necessary, I think, to explain the scope of the problem we face today, where it's not just that there's an urban housing shortage, in urban neighborhoods, but that, inner ring suburbs also aren't adding new housing to accommodate demand. And as a result of this simultaneous aversion to new housing in cities and inner ring suburbs, we see what you saw in that slide I had toward the end, which is the persistence of exurban sprawl in all these metro areas that I'm associating with anti-growth politics. And so I think that is important to understand, because it does reveal, we can assess whether the anti-growth movement succeeded or failed. And in a big way, I think that is evidence of its failure, at least on a kind of metropolitan scale.
Well, fortunately, there are lots and lots of questions, which tells us that there's a huge audience and interest in the work that you're doing. I do have to smile that the environmental protection hustle was actually Bernie Frieden, the author. I believe it came out while he was the director of what was our predecessor, the old joint Harvard-MIT Joint Center for Urban Studies. And I know from my looks in the files, it was actually very controversial among people who liked the Joint Center, in a way reflecting that split in liberalism that you just talked about. I found this talk fascinating, and I think for our purposes, I'm struck that almost every State of the Nation's housing report, our signature report, at some point talks about the need for regulatory reform in a way to get at some of the structures that you've put in place. And as you say, that sounds easy. It, just like community control, sounds easy. And I think what you've done is really provided us a really rich context to understand, where things came from and how hard it is to make significant changes in those. And that, it seems to me, is very much the job of a historian. I know you're on track to finish your thesis. I really, having read some of the draft chapters, I really hope that it comes out as a book. I think you have a fascinating story to tell. I know from reading some of it, you tell it well, as you demonstrated here. And I want to thank you for a wonderful, fascinating, and provocative discussion. You can't see all the folks online, but based on the questions we've had, I think lots of folks will agree with me. So thank you very much, Jacob, and everybody. We'll see you again online in less than a week. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for joining.